Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we discuss a subject that you've requested, questions about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. If you have a question that you'd like to submit for us to consider for an episode, you can send that in via email to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org or text podcast to 94000.
Is anyone really checking that email?
Yeah, so that voice that you just heard, that's Hunter. He's here with me too. Hunter's one of our pastors. And yes, Hunter, if you were to email podcast@fellowshipdenver.org today, that email would pop up in my inbox and I would respond and say, thanks so much for submitting a question. I'm really glad to hear from you.
You are one of the most responsible and nicest people I know. So to know you're on the other end of the email is so comforting.
Thank you. You can even give it a test run after this episode, if you'd like, so that you can say that with veracity to our listeners.
Well, great. Well, who are you?
Well, my name is Autumn, a responsible, kind person. Per Hunter. My name is Autumn. I'm the host of the Vision for Life podcast. And today, Hunter and I are going to be considering the question of what if I don't want to read the Bible? Or what if I don't feel like reading the Bible? This question really is one that considers our desire and what to do when we identify and acknowledge that our desire or lack of desire is out of step with what we think or know intellectually. So the way we're processing this might be, I think I should read the Bible, but I don't want to, or I don't feel like it, so now what? And this really is on the heels of our last episode in which we concluded with, so you should read the Bible because it gives you particular insight from God's perspective and a certain wisdom for life that we can't gain in any other way except God's revelation of himself. And yet, even if we acknowledge that or believe that, sometimes our desire is out of step. So that's what we're talking about today. Do you have anything you want to add?
Earlier this summer, I hosted a learning community called Daily Life with God, and one of the things I was fascinated to discover is that a lot of people came to that learning community thinking, I know I should spend time with God reading my Bible to get what we're calling Vision for Life every day, and yet I don't exactly know how to do it. So it was fun to walk through that with folks. But today we're dealing with kind of a second question that we've gotten, and we've heard it a lot during COVID, and some have even written in with it, and I've certainly even been living through this a bit, which is, what if I just don't have the drive or the desire or the want to right now? What if my energy is just low, or life is maybe a little bit overwhelming, and the desire I have to read the Bible to get God's perspective on life, even if it's something I know I should do, it's just not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've experienced this too in my home this summer, and at the end of the spring, it's looked like the fact that both my husband and I work full time, and we have 3 kids, and so with school and children's programming being drastically impacted in light of coronavirus, then that means that we're trying to fit in a lot of work hours around things. So juggling taking care of kids and fitting in work means that our time simply isn't structured the same. And so that's an aspect too that factors into this discussion. What do we do when suddenly our life sort of rhythms are upended, and that impacts both our ability and our desire and our energy, as you mentioned?
And I have no kids, and I work from home full time, and I have found that these rhythms of working from home have been really tiring, like physically tiring to me. And so that has made it more difficult for me, just being physically tired.
Yeah, and that impacts your, like you said, your want to, your desire. So what do we do if we find ourselves in that state? Acknowledging that a way we know God, a way we gain wisdom for life, vision for life, is through reading the Bible and meeting God there in that way. And yet we're struggling with this lack of desire. Therefore, the question that we're considering is, what if I don't want to read the Bible or feel like reading the Bible?
It's a great question, and I think the place to begin is, first of all, before we even talk about what to do, which we want to talk about today, is just to try to understand why. Like I just mentioned one reason. The why for me was just sometimes related to physical energy. And in terms of reading and thinking and praying, is connected to our bodies, even though we may tend to think of those things as disembodied. It's connected to our bodies, and I have a lot more energy for it when my body is not tired. So just to acknowledge, I'm in a season where the stress of having to make a lot of decisions and navigate a lot of things has affected my body, and so I'm feeling tired. But that's not always the reason. You mentioned that just life is chaotic, and that can be a reason. And I would encourage people always to drill down even below that. And I know that other times in life I've just experienced that I'm disappointed maybe with how life is working out, and then if I go down deeper than that, I'm actually kind of disappointed with God. And so it can be hard to meet with someone who you're disappointed with or you're frustrated with. So that's sometimes there in seasons of suffering, and sometimes I revert into ways of thinking that are really not gospel-informed ways of thinking. They're really not bringing the gospel to bear on how I imagine and how I think about God and what His disposition toward me is, and therefore I don't want to meet with Him.
And then that cycle begins to repeat itself. When you don't want to meet with Him, then that again affects your desire and your idea of what you should and shouldn't be doing, and can drive you further into that place where it feels harder then to begin again. It really is freeing to think about that. So if you're experiencing this lack of desire, just first ask an honest, why might that be? Is it because of my life systems being interrupted? Is it because I feel physical fatigue or some other physical ailment that is making my energy level different and difficult then to engage with God in this way, to find the energy to read and think and dwell on the content that's in the Bible that sometimes can feel hard to approach anyhow, regardless of those things. Asking an honest why, though, sometimes isn't our natural tendency. Sometimes if we have this idea that we should be reading and then we experience our desire being out of step with that, then we have other tendencies that are sort of like, well, I now feel guilty or ashamed, and so I'm going to turn away from God instead of turning back to Him. So that
Yes.
idea of starting there, but just asking why.
Feelings of guilt, shame, I'm a failure, I'm not getting it done, those can multiply like any habit that you may know intellectually is not great for you, but it's just so easy. So if I get in a habit of eating bad food, it's just easy to stay in that habit, and it's hard to break out of it, even if I intellectually know this food is not good for me. And this can also happen with how we imagine God, which then affects how we spend time or don't spend time with Him on a daily basis.
So then what's the next step? If we ask why and do find that we can attribute it to some things going on in our lives or in our hearts, our minds, it can be a variety of things that can actually keep us from wanting to read our Bibles, wanting to spend time with God. So we ask why, and then what do we do?
Well, I'll give away the answer. The answer is just to do it anyway. But I want to put some context around that, and I think to ask, what is God like? What is His disposition toward us? And there's a passage in Hebrews that I come back to over and over and over again. It's kind of one of those passages that's just shaped my life, and that I've referred to at so many different seasons of life, and it really feels appropriate for this particular time. And it's at the end of Hebrews chapter 4. And what's going on in Hebrews is that these followers of Jesus are suffering a lot of opposition, and being a Christian is not fun and exciting like it used to be. And so they're struggling with their faith. They're struggling with even deciding to continue in their faith, much less to draw near to God. And so
And they're experiencing actual external opposition.
that's right, external opposition of some kind, and it's sapping their joy, and it's impacting their regular circumstances, their work, their social life. It's all been kind of diminished as a result of this. So the author of Hebrews at the end of chapter 4 kind of concludes the chapter like this. He says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." So first of all, he wants to say, imagine Jesus. Think of what Jesus is like. God is like Jesus. And here's what Jesus is like. He is sympathetic to your weakness. He's felt it. He's lived through it. He's experienced the same thing. He's endured it, and yet with no trace of sin. And that's not a Jesus juke to be like, I mean, Jesus endured that, and he didn't sin, so why can't you? He's just saying he's able to sympathize with us, and he knows what we're going through. Mm-hmm. And then the author of Hebrews says, "So let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." This passage first came to me at a time in my life, in my late 20s, when I was spiritually exhausted and also physically tired too. But this passage was something I had never seen at that time. I had been a follower of Jesus at that point for a decade, and this had never hit me. And it hit me through this passage, and that is that God's grace is not just to forgive me of my sin, and it's not just to get me into his kingdom. Like when I first believed, I got grace and mercy. And it's not just to get me in, and it's not just to forgive me of my sin. His grace is also an ongoing gift to give me energy and life and power and strength that I need to keep following Jesus. So grace is like a constant drip. It's a constant drip. It's constantly available. It's an over and over and over again gift. And it's not just forgiveness. It's also power and life and energy and vitality. Then when I started to study a little bit more, I found that mercy is really a word that emphasizes God's sympathy for us in our weakness. So mercy is not just like, oh, you sinned and I forgive you. Mercy is also like you're suffering or you're struggling, and I'm sympathetic to your plight.
So we find ourselves in this state, wrestling with our desire or lack of desire, and examine ourselves, our lives, our hearts, and then actually turn and look at Jesus and remember what is true of him. And it's on that basis, the fact that he is sympathetic and compassionate and felt the depth of our weakness, and he hurt, and he understands and sympathizes with that, and yet he did not sin. So we examine ourselves and then look at Jesus, and it's on that basis, the basis of Jesus, that we then approach God. And there we find what you just described, grace and mercy.
That's right. And the author of Hebrews is making the point that Jesus endured all that, and now he says at the beginning, he's passed through the heavens. He's our high priest. So he's actually now in a position of authority and power, seated at the right hand of the Father. And from this position of authority and power, he's using all his power to sustain the people that are going through the same thing that he went through.
Wow. What does that have to do with our desire and our ability? You mentioned it very briefly before you started explaining this passage in Hebrews. How does that, what you just talked to us about, what we just considered together, connect to then our desire and our ability to engage God and to engage his revelation of himself to us in the Bible?
It sets our expectation for what God is going to do for us and what we think he's like. So his heart for us, is to give us grace and is to sustain us. And what is he going to do? Well, the author of Hebrews says, let us then with confidence draw near. So we should have a confidence that God is going to meet us with grace in that situation when we draw near to receive that grace from him. And I think this is so important because one of the lifelong journeys for me has been to rewire my thinking when I am tired or discouraged or overwhelmed, to rewire my thinking and to think, this is a situation that I should expect God to show up and give me strength and power in. Not just that I should hope that God would show up and give me strength and power, not just that I should pray that he'll show up and give me strength and power, but I should actually expect that in this situation, God wants to and will show up and give me grace. So it's a weird thing to go, I'm tired, I'm not doing well, maybe I'm discouraged, maybe I'm a little out of sorts, maybe I don't feel like I'm performing well, I'm not keeping up my end of the bargain, therefore my expectation goes up. That's a weird thing to say, right? Because we're so used to, because the non-gospel way of relating to God is, according to my performance and my effort, God blesses me. That's the non-gospel way of relating. So it's about totally inverting our expectations. Now that I can't perform and that I don't have any energy, God's going to step in and meet me. I don't just hope for that. I confidently expect it.
And that's indicated to us in that passage in verses 16 and 17 that say, let us boldly approach God's throne, and we will receive mercy and we will find grace to help us.
I love it. I love it. That leads into now actually doing it. So
we have to still approach.
That's right. Old theologians would talk about grace and then means of grace. So grace is God's gift. It's this disposition to constantly sustain his people. That's grace. It's for all of life. Now, means of grace is just a way of saying that God supplies us that grace through particular means. I was talking to my dentist last week, and she was explaining that I have a low vitamin B12 problem.
Is it serious?
It might be. I get these little ulcers inside my mouth that run in my family for generations. Like my grandma complained about those things forever, and my mom, and then now me. So I was kind of explaining this to my dentist, and she says, you probably have a genetic B12 problem, and you should take B12 supplement. Now this is and she told me which ones to take. Now this is a great illustration. There is a means of getting B12. You can actually get it from eating lots and lots of red meat, which sounds like a better means to me, but my doctor chastises me for that. So
that's one means, but that means might have other implications.
Other problems. So I've been trying to reduce my red meat diet, but it's created this other problem. But there are means of vitamin B12. There's ways you can go about getting it, and it's mostly through a pill that has it in it. But the point is really simple. It's like, you need vitamin B12, and it doesn't just magically come to you. Rather, there are particular vehicles for delivering that to you. So when we talk about means of grace, we're saying God has an infinite supply of power and life to give you, and there are particular ways that he delivers that to you. So the exhortation of the author of Hebrews here is draw near with confidence to the throne of grace. The throne of grace is the means of grace, and we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. So the author of Hebrews is actually saying, make use of the means that God has provided.
When you say the means is the throne of grace, I still feel a little unclear as to how we access that. What is that prayer? Is that Bible reading? What is is there a more, I guess, simple explanation? God's grace is available. we take advantage of this means of grace.
Yes, the common means of grace that God uses are His Word and prayer and the body of Christ. That's what you see. And then sometimes we talk about special means of grace, like the sacraments being ways. Like the Lord's Supper, I believe, is a way that God sustains us when we partake of it by faith. But the common means of grace, I think this is in Hebrews, in the context of Hebrews, this is a really fancy way of exhorting people to pray, to stay engaged with the Scriptures. They didn't necessarily have a Bible bound like we do, but to stay engaged with the Scriptures and to stay engaged with the body of Christ. That's what you see happening throughout the book.
And that's the same exhortation to us that was given to the Hebrews. They had this means of grace, and so do we. That's
right. And so I read this passage, and the way I apply it to myself is in times when I am tired, or when I'm discouraged, or when I'm confused or overwhelmed, and I need grace, then what I actually need to do is to make perhaps even more use of the means of grace, which basically means I need to pray, and I need to read my Bible, as we talked about, and I need to do that even if I'm doing it tired and fatigued, and I feel like I'm just going through the motions. I need to do that with expectation, or I can do that with expectation and confidence that God's going to show up and He's going to meet me in that. So that's what I do.
And that then is actually becomes the supply of what it is that we feel we're lacking. So if you ask, why do I feel this way? And you say, well, I feel this way. I feel this lack of desire, this lack of want to, because I'm tired. Well, in your tiredness, you can still boldly approach God, trusting that He will supply what it is you lack, that He will give you grace, and that you will receive mercy. And sometimes I find this to be true in that, I'm curious if you would say this also, I find this to be true in that it actually helps me think through differently and reframe what it is that I believe I lack. So right now I described my life, it's kind of, I'm fitting in work in the morning and in the evening, around juggling kids between me and my husband. And so I feel like I lack time, which is in one sense true. I do. And yet when I say, okay, I am going to determine to still approach the throne of grace, that then I find what I think I lacked, even if it still is not the amount of time that I would desire, is actually supplied to me when I trust that God will help me find the time, or for work or for kids, or to adjust those things accordingly.
I love what you're saying, and one of the ways I love to pray during these times is to when I pray, just to name whatever it is I think I need, and to just ask God for it. And also that helps me to trust that if He supplies that in a slightly different way, that He's wiser and smarter than me.
Yes.
But I just name what I think I need. Here's what I think I need, and right now, and here are the problems I am wrestling with.
So when you find yourself feeling this way, perhaps right now, in our strange hybrid way of life that is COVID existence, when you find yourself feeling tired, what are some things you have done to continue practically to approach God? You mentioned teaching the class Daily Life with God, so perhaps there's some content you shared in that class, or just some things you've done in your personal life that are ways in which you put this into practice, this approaching the throne of grace, engaging the means of grace, so prayer, Bible reading, and the family of God, our community in Christ. How have you gone about putting that into action when you feel this way?
Yeah, I've have a very simple way of spending a little bit of time with God every day, and it's simple enough to where if I have 20 minutes, I can take 20 minutes and do it, and if I have an hour, I can take an hour and do it. And it's a simple way where I have a journal typically, I don't write reams and reams. I just make a few notes in it, but I start with yesterday. I put yesterday, and I just review anything from the previous day where I especially look for where my emotions were extreme, like things that were really joyful about yesterday, or things that were really difficult about yesterday. And then I'll just look for things that stand out about the day. It could be a conversation I had with someone where something came to mind. I just bullet point a few things from yesterday that happened, and if nothing significant happened, I just write down this is what I did, and that's it, you know. And then I have a simple Bible reading plan, and I just open and read 2 or 3 chapters of the Bible, and I try to just listen for what God might be wanting to give me that day from that. So I look for, what does this passage tell me about what God is like, and is there anything here that relates to yesterday? And I just listen and see what comes to mind. It's not a Bible study. I just read it and see what comes to mind, and then I pray. And I can do that I did it in 20 minutes this morning. I literally had 20 minutes before I had to leave to come to church, and so I sat down. I made 2 bullet points about yesterday, and I read 3 chapters.
You've mentioned, too, some other things that you've done to re-engage your interaction with the Bible in different ways. For instance, I think you mentioned a couple of weeks ago in a sermon that you sometimes go for a walk and put in some earbuds and listen to either a Bible passage or some songs. Is that another way that if someone is feeling sort of stuck?
Absolutely. We have the gift of Spotify, and so we can just pull up worship songs. And I'm not a person who listens to a lot of Christian music except at church, but I have loaded up a list of worship songs, and I'll just go for a walk and listen to a couple of songs and meditate on the words of the song as they're being sung over me. And in that space, I'm not asking God for a bunch of things. I'm just meditating on the words of the song, and that's really life-giving.
I have found in different seasons that just changing the method in which I'm going about interacting with God has been helpful to ignite my curiosity again, to help me think about God differently and sort of reinstate this relationship. Like, wow, I've missed spending time with God. And so in that, doing it, putting it into action, if I've been reading and then have gotten a little bit stuck, feel this lack of desire, then maybe I might switch to listening to the Bible for a season, or vice versa. If I've been listening and then suddenly I find myself not really paying attention or engaging, I'll start reading again. It's not always haphazard. Sounds a little bit like that when I said it. But for a season, I would engage in one mode or the other. And then I have a really simple prayer that I wrote out that I try to read through every morning that asks me to trust God with whatever the day holds. So to help me hold my day open-handedly and say, God, I am asking for your grace to give space to the disappointments that I might face today, to give space to the conversations that I'm going to have today, to give space to the frustrations with my kids that I might face today, and just have this simple prayer that I try to read through each day and kind of commit my day to God in that way. And that's something I did last year, and then it has been really life-giving, but it was something new that I just started doing last year in the mornings.
Well, you should upload that to the show notes. I have my daily life with God prayer and reading rhythm kind of written out that I can, in a way, I can just show it to people. I'll upload that to the show notes and just share these resources. I love what you mentioned about changing the rhythm when you need to. And I have this daily rhythm that I try to do daily, regardless of how I feel. And there are seasons when I'm more consistent than others, but I have this daily rhythm. But I will also sometimes add to my daily rhythm something that's just for a season or just for a time that kind of breaks me out of maybe the mundanity of kind of what I've fallen into. And I had that happen recently, and it comes out of this mindset again. It's like, okay, I'm actually not feeling terribly vital right now. I'm not feeling full of life and full of energy. Therefore, I need to draw near to the throne of grace more. So rather than going, I'm not feeling full of life, I'm not feeling full of energy, therefore, I'm not going to do it because I'm not going to do what I don't want to do. Rather, I'm not feeling full of life, I'm not feeling full of energy, so I'm going to draw near to the throne of grace more. And so that's what I'm asking, and I did this just 2 weeks ago. I think I mentioned it briefly on our last episode. I sensed this, that I need to draw near more to the throne of grace. And so I just laid out a rhythm for 40 days that I was going to follow just for a 40-day period. And it just added something to my morning routine. And it's actually added at a different time of day. And in the evenings, after dinner, I go for a walk. And I have about 4 themes that I'm praying through every day on that walk. And just seeing how the prayers develop. And I had one night this week where God really met me in that space. I ended up walking for an hour. I didn't anticipate to go walking for an hour, but I ended up walking for an hour because he was meeting me as I was asking him for help with just something I was wrestling with.
Do you mind, Hunter, if I share one just from my experience as a mom and struggling when I had little kids? My youngest is 4 now, so she's getting out of the season of life in which the need for continual care and attention is lessening. Even so, life with 3 kids can be full. And so I really struggled with this when my older kids were younger, the idea that I should be doing this. It feels really hard. I maybe even want to, but just don't know where to fit it in. And so I, at that point in time, tried to start thinking about how I could do some things with my kids, because it seemed like morning to night, it was just full. And so I didn't know when I could take some time alone. So recently, then I've kind of imported that idea. And recently I found a friend shared with me this really short, sweet podcast that's a daily reading that's about 8 minutes. And at night, my kids and I can just listen to it together. And it's really soothing. And it reads a short passage 3 times. And this is a way that then, regardless of what my day has been like, if I build that rhythm in and I'm doing it with my kids, that it enabled me to have that time as well, that we quiet our hearts and our minds and do it together. So I think there's an aspect to what you mentioned with the walking and of creativity. God offers this relationship to us as a part of our whole lives. And so it doesn't necessarily always get to be or have to be segmented into a specific frame in which we thought it had to be. So I just encourage, for our parents and moms particularly, if you are feeling like that, I sympathize with you and am praying for you and hope that you also will find some freedom in these creative ways to incorporate this time approaching God into your day, even if it doesn't look like what you hoped or thought it might.
And you brought your kids into it, which is great. To piggyback off of that, one of the guys in my men's discipleship group this week was sharing how he's been struggling to read the Bible on a regular basis. And so he started just first thing in the morning, going downstairs, sitting at his kitchen table, and reading a few passages of Scripture while his kids were running around him, and they get to watch Dad do this. And he's like, I'm just going to embrace the chaos. I'm just going to sit there and read this, and they're going to get to see me doing it. If they interrupt me, they interrupt me. And he's just doing it with the kids. So it's not Dad off having an hour by himself. Don't interrupt him. It's just Dad sitting at the table. This is how he was just, I love the determination that he has, that I'm just going to do this and expect that God's going to meet me in it.
Expect to find that grace and mercy there.
That's right.
Well, that wraps up our discussion for today. Hunter, thanks so much for sharing with us, for sharing your heart and some of how you put this into practice in your own life. I've enjoyed our discussion, and I hope our listeners have. If you would like to submit a question for us to consider for a podcast episode, you can email that question in to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. As I mentioned before, I will get that email and answer it. Or you can text podcast to 94000.
This is a great time for me to remind you that Vision for Life is a ministry of Fellowship Denver that exists in two forms. One is this podcast, and the other form is a series of seminars where we discuss complex issues that shape our lives and often shape our public witness as followers of Jesus. I'm telling you that because on September 21st, which is a Monday night, we are going to kick off a 4-week seminar on politics. And all I have to say is politics, and you know why that's important. And so over the course of 4 Monday nights, we're going to discuss the political activity that most of us are involved in, which is discussing and debating politics, voting, and how we decide how we're going to vote, plus further engagement in the political sphere of our city's life and our nation's life. We'll also be discussing some larger trends in American history that shape the political atmosphere that we're all living in today. So I hope you'll make plans to join us. You can register in advance at fellowshipdenver.org.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. This podcast is based on your questions and suggestions. To submit a question, you can send it in via email to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org or via text by texting podcast to 94000. Thanks to our guest, Hunter Beaumont, to Adam Englund for our theme music, and to our producer, Jesse Cowan.